Oh, I also learned another terrible thing today. Apparently, both Mike Harris's son and then I don't know who Michael Ford is, but a nephew of Doug Ford, both got elected as
I
MPPs.
saw a tweet this morning, and it was like, I can't remember if it was David Moscorp or somebody that followed him, but they were like, it's like ants at a picnic.
Oh, that's horrible.
I was like, oh shit, it's true though. Like,
The Fords just they keep coming and coming, and you can never get rid of them.
no, exactly. Once one finds it, you're screwed.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kenny.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of David Cronenberg's favorite podcast.
It's Speech from the Throne, episode 13. We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the halls of power.
But not with more remixes of the Doug Ford dad rock campaign classic, Get It Done. We're just here to argue.
Hey Jacob, what are we arguing about today?
Well, Liam, yesterday, Ontario had an election.
Did they?
And I know it might come as a shocker to many of the audience. In fact, it seems that it came as a bit of a shock to many Ontarians because only 43% of the voting public could bother to show up. Perhaps us joking about it being a sleeper of election may have failed us as progressives because it seems like a great number of Ontarians couldn't even bother to wake up for this. I was just looking back at our catalog, and I remember when we were recording the episode that was in regards to the leaders' debate. We released that podcast basically a week after the debate had happened, and you and I were discussing whether or not it was okay, but at the end, we decided to release it because the campaign was so slow. There was nothing happening. We figured, you know what? A week may have passed, but the story is exactly the same. Our insights were just as good as they were before. And there are very few campaigns you can say that about. Like, usually, day to day, we're getting some news information, some news story, some breaking event that's going to completely upset, or that the parties are at least trying to completely upset voters' expectations and change voters' minds. Nothing this round. Doug Ford started ahead, he ended ahead. The real story of last night was a complete collapse of the Liberal Party. And, Del Duca, he came out trying to say, oh, the Liberals, we started really, really low, and we paid off our debts, and we're a stronger voice in Parliament. Stronger voice in Parliament. They started with 7 MPPs. They now have 8 MPPs. That's a much stronger voice.
So strong you can almost hear them shouting from the back of the legislature.
Yeah, and the terrible thing about this, Liam, is that, if you can believe it, 20,000 fewer people voted for the Liberal Party in this election than the past one.
I can believe that.
Simply because turnout was so low. So you think that the 2018 election, that was the absolute collapse? Guess what? They still, from rock bottom, were unable to convince a single other voter to join them. They just hit another rock bottom. And then, of course, the NDP, what can we say about that? We got mediocrity on top of mediocrity. They lost some seats. They still ended up being official opposition, but they cannot break outside of their traditional hold in the city centres and in southwestern Ontario. They have a really, really low ceiling. And so, of course, with two opposition parties that were more interested in knife-fighting each other than actually trying to defeat him, Doug Ford sailed to victory with an even bigger majority than before. So there I have 2 takeaways, I would say, from this election. Number 1, if I'm Doug Ford, right now, my number 1 priority is learning French, because it seems like he isn't just the most powerful conservative in the country. That is undisputed. But he might just be the only conservative who is able to take this formula of, moving working class voters and socially conservative voters and rural voters and some even urban voters all together into a giant big tent party that can win against a divided progressive opposition. The Conservatives federally have completely failed. They've become enraptured by the far right. And Doug Ford, in 2018, he won 76 seats. And then throughout the course of his 4 years in government, 8 of his 76 MPPs were eventually kicked out of caucus because they became basically too far right for the general public to accept. And whereas the Conservatives, basically, the federal Conservatives have allowed themselves to get to get embroiled with this far-right section of the party, Ford pushed them away. He pushed them out of caucus, and tonight he was rewarded for doing that. There was two startup far-right parties, the New Blue and the Ontario Party. They both failed to get a significant showing. And again, those 8 MPPs that had been kicked away, that were no longer running for the PCs, none of them got elected on any banner back. They're all gone now. Doug Ford's mainstream PCs became the real winner, and he, in fact, grew his majority. This is a strategy that I think can go national. And even if he doesn't want to take the job of Prime Minister, I can feel we have another Conservative dynasty brewing. And just in the same way that, Jim Flaherty, Tony Clement, and John Baird came from the Harris government and then eventually took that strategy to win federally for the Conservatives, I have a very strong feeling that what we're watching and what we watch tonight is the front benches forming of what's going to be a new Conservative party federally that's going to beat Justin Trudeau or whoever succeeds Justin Trudeau. No matter who wins this Conservative party leadership federally, it's probably going to be a disaster either way. If there's someone who can actually bring that party back to power, I'm thinking it's Ford. So we can talk about that. And then next, the second takeaway, we have Mike Schreiner. I think he's the only opposition party leader that could really count himself as any sort of success. The other two, of course, resigned last night. And I think, rather than just contenting himself with leading a hopelessly irrelevant party in the Greens, Mike Schreiner, who already sounds like an NDPer, he should just become the leader of the NDP. He needs to run for the leadership of the NDP. The NDP is already a very factional party. They have coalitions of a whole bunch of different interest groups. Environmentalists, as formed by the Green Party, could fit very well in the NDP, and there already is an environmentalist faction within the NDP that could prop him up. I think it's time for progressive parties to start consolidating. I've always been someone that believes that the Liberals and the NDP should unite. I think we saw plenty of evidence last night to prove why that should be the case. Unfortunately, that seems pretty much impossible. The two leaderships of those two parties hate each other's guts. However, we can start the consolidation somewhere with a bold, come-from-behind victory for the NDP leadership that no one sees coming. Mike Schreiner puts his name forward and takes that party to new heights it could never reach without him. So those are my two main takeaways. I guess the first one, I don't want to see Doug Ford become the Prime Minister, but I have a feeling that him or someone in his cabinet is almost certain to become the Prime Minister now, after last night. And then two, what I do want to see is Mike Schreiner run for the leadership of the NDP and combine the Greens and the NDP. So at least we get some consolidation on the left. Because that's really what happened last night. It's not that Doug Ford won, it's that the left collapsed. The left failed to coalesce behind a single alternative.
Yep. I think, I have a lot of thoughts on all that. A lot of thoughts. First observation, which is about Doug Ford, and I think you're spot on. Doug Ford, we've talked about, I believe if it was the Ontario episode we did a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how he's become a master of messaging. He's become very good at staying on message, and that wasn't something that you would say about a Ford until like 2 years ago. He's really mastered the art of selling his package in a way that even, and I'm not saying he's like the greatest thing since sliced bread here, but I mean, like, he's mastered his messaging in a way that allows him to run rings around his opponents, particularly when they were Andrea Horwath and Steven Del Duca, and he's got the message, Doug Ford gets it done. He's dispelling the notions about Conservatives being purse clutchers by loosening the purse strings and spending money on all sorts of things, which for a lot of centrist and center-left voters makes them indistinguishable from the Liberals, who also promised to spend a lot of big money on things, on things that were rather gimmicky. Buck a Ride in principle isn't gimmicky. What's gimmicky is that it was only until 2024, and there were all these ifs, ands, or buts with everything that they decided to promise. If Ontarians who bothered to figure out who Steven Del Duca was spent more than 2 minutes on their reading their platform. So the Tories have done a very good job at essentially sucking the life out of the election, keeping their candidates away from the media, keeping their candidates away from debates, having as little room for error as possible because, God forbid, a candidate might go to a debate and say something or talk to the media and say something. So they ran a very quiet frontrunner campaign. and they ran to the left. I don't want to say to the left of the Liberals because they didn't, but they ran just close enough to the Liberals that they were basically indistinguishable, and it dwarfed any chance in hell that Steven Del Duca had. Let's get on to the Liberals. The Liberals were completely ineffective. Despite some signs of, I thought, early promise in the campaign, it went out with a whimper. Nobody to this day hardly even knows who Steven Del Duca is. He, for whatever reason, just wasn't able to get his face out there. I'm sure the party will do a post-mortem on why that was. I had doubts about his leadership from the start. I was worried, particularly when the Ontario Liberal Party voted to restrict its leadership contest to just delegates instead of the wider membership. It's a very antiquated way of doing things. And that's what happened when the federal Liberals got together in 2008, a bunch of delegates, and voted in an uncharismatic academic as their leader. And there's nothing wrong with academics. We like academics, but not when they're uncharismatic, because trying to sell an uncharismatic academic to the Canadian or Ontarian public is like trying to read a fourth grade math textbook and not fall asleep. It's arcane, it's boring, it gives you flashbacks to worse days. What can I say? Any chance that the Liberals had in the beginning it just went out with a whimper, not a bang. And you would see Del Duca in these debates with Ford and with Horwath, and there's nothing wrong with a little bit of sniping here and there, but they got totally sucked into just sniping on each other while Doug Ford stood there and repeated what he was going to get done. So
Yep.
Despite the fact that I think what they were trying to do was knock the other down in the poll, what they wound up doing was just splitting the vote and getting people to stay home because they didn't want to be shamed into strategic voting for people they didn't like. So, we've seen the lowest turnout in Ontario history, 43%. Both parties, both left-wing parties, the NDP and the Liberals, were like, no, I'm the choice. No, I'm the choice. No, I'm the choice for progressive voters and center-left voters. They annoyed the hell out of everybody who either stayed home or didn't vote for them. And here, I'm going to switch to the NDP here, but as I transition to the NDP sort of from the Liberals, I'm going to comment on how both the NDP and the Liberals spent 4 years telling us that Doug Ford was a grandma killer, and which I think there's some truth.
It's probably
there's
true.
truth to the province's negligence in causing COVID deaths. There is, and maybe people don't want to hear that, and they want to say, oh, but it's hard because nobody wants to think that their government has been negligent with that stuff, but they have been. And the Liberals and the NDP did a very poor job making a case for that. They should have made the entire election not about just hating Doug Ford because he's Doug Ford, about being angry at Doug Ford for all of the terrible mishaps that have occurred in his government and that he's been allowed to escape from. And they spent the whole time, or basically the whole time, attacking each other. I mean, Andrea Horwath got in a few good lines about Doug Ford's developer buddies at the debate. But why wasn't that her main, that should have been her main theme. I think you've said this too, Jacob. It should have been all about Doug's buddies and Doug's friends and Doug's, you could easily construct a compelling narrative from that, and they just didn't. They just talked about their own arcane policies that nobody bothered to read because people have had enough of Horwath, who's been in there for 13 years, and she was never going to get it. And they don't even know who Del Duca is, and they don't care. And they don't want to put the Liberals back in government without a compelling reason to do so. And buck a ride until 2024 isn't going to do it. So, I mean, to focus on the NDP, and then I'll briefly touch on the Greens.
Yeah.
And your hypothesis about, or your idea for Mike Schreiner. The NDP in specific have had the same leader for 13 years, and it was a long time ago that they should have refreshed her. She wisely did the right thing and stepped down, as did Del Duca. Thank God, because I was honestly entertaining the chance that both of them would attempt to stay on, and it would be even sadder. And I was watching the results come in last night, and it's just the state where things are at in those parties. Andrea Horwath is, sure, she got the NDP to official opposition. I suppose that's an achievement, but if they'd stuck with her any longer, they'd be parked there indefinitely. And Steven Del Duca was picked because he by far had the most organized campaign among delegates. He was the best organizer.
Yep.
And that's not a knock at him. I'm just saying that sometimes the best organizers aren't the best leaders, and he got in, and I had reservations about him from the beginning because he was a Wynne cabinet minister, and that instantly ties you to the previous government's record. I don't think people are angry at him personally, but I do think that people are still angry at the Liberals from the last term. So I think a big mistake was picking an old guy that had a long record that could be dredged up in debate. And I think there were other candidates like Alvin Tedjo, Tedjo, He was a fantastic Ontario Liberal candidate that ran against Del Duca. He had bold ideas like actually implementing a basic income, like dismantling the Ontario Catholic school system. There's no reason to be funding religious schools publicly anymore. He was going to sort of transition that system to all one big public system. No one else will touch that. Not that that's a pressing issue, but I mean, like, these are things that people have ignored out of convenience for decades. And he, there were people with fresh ideas that wanted to get things done, and they picked the old win guy. And that's exactly why they're back where they are now. And as for the Greens, I mean, as you said, like, I don't know, Mike Schreiner certainly doesn't have anything to resign about. I was a little disappointed that they weren't able to pull off Parry Sound. I mean, I guess it was a huge ask. Like, I think they came within like about 2,000 votes, just under 2,000 votes.
It was very
so. I mean,
close.
like, that's a blue stronghold. So it's a long shot.
And that was in a riding where the PCs had won 48% in the past election. So they basically had to consolidate all the left-wing vote to win there.
Well, and there was no liberal. There was no
close.
Liberal candidate. So I think Liberals were split between Greens and PCs, I'm guessing, and NDP. Like, I'm guessing those votes were split up, and the math didn't quite work out for Matt Richter to get in, which is a shame. Like, it would have been nice to see Mike have somebody else at Queen's Park. I agree with you, Jacob, that it would be a fantastic idea for Mike Schreiner to run for the NDP because he's a good leader and he knows his stuff. He knows his book well. He's a likable guy. He's, I think, an easy guy for the public to get to know. I think the public is getting to know him a little bit more. That said, their challenge has always been gaining seats, and you're not going to gain seats in the Green Party under first past the post, or unless there's a total collapse like we saw in PEI, where the Greens are official opposition because of a complete Liberal collapse. That can happen. It doesn't happen very often. If Mike Schreiner ran for the NDP, it would be a really good thing, but I don't think it's going to happen because, as you noted, the NDP and the Green hate each other's guts. The Liberals and the NDP hate each other's guts. So I just don't see that happening. I think it would be a wise thing to do. I don't know how realistic it is. As for Doug Ford wanting to be prime minister, I think he always kind of has been interested in running for prime minister one day. And if whoever gets in, whether it's Pierre Poilievre or Charest, whoever wins their leadership, if they implode in the next general, then that'll be Ford's opening for sure. He will have had 7 or 8 years by that time. So I'm sure, he could probably say he's resigning, get someone else to replace him and run for the Tories then if he wanted to. And I wouldn't be surprised if he did, because he gets that balance right of understanding what's too far for centrist voters these days, whereas the federal Conservatives do not understand what's too far for the average Canadian these days because they're too busy flirting with the far right. Whereas Doug Ford seems to have learned something from the Tim Houston formula of keeping anybody who's center right or more quiet. And
or getting rid of them, putting them outside of the caucus.
Or getting rid of them, which both Houston and Ford did, getting rid of various MPPs or MLAs that were against lockdowns. Whereas Federal Conservative Party, they're just having an absolute time and a half tearing themselves apart over that. So I think Doug Ford would be an infinitely better leader of that party. And I wouldn't have said that 2 years ago, but I think he'd be an infinitely better leader than a Scheer or for sure a Poilievre. It would be nice to see Mike Schreiner front the NDP. He'd be far more effective. Will he? Probably not. So it's going to be interesting to see what that future looks like. Will Alvin Tedjo and some of the other candidates run again for the Liberals? Will they be able to introduce themselves to the public better? They're certainly going to have to, because for a party that was in government 15 years to return with the same amount of seats in the subsequent election where they were supposed to, at a minimum, get to official party status, that is a colossal failure for one of the founding parties of the province.
Well, I guess as progressives, if there's going to be one takeaway, and there's no way for us to consolidate parties because for some reason we hate each other, I think that for disillusioned liberals like you and myself, Liam, and we know many, many other disillusioned liberals, we have to give up on this Ontario Liberal Party. It's just humiliating defeat after humiliating defeat without any interest in changing. We'll see who they elect next. I highly doubt it's going to be someone particularly revolutionary. I think that the NDP has proven itself at this point to be the only credible alternative to the progressive Conservatives in Ontario. And if we continue to be in this split of orange and red, we're just going to end up with 40 more years of the PCs. Exactly what happened in the 1940s to the 1980s when we had 40 years of uninterrupted PC rule in Ontario.
Yeah. That's
how we got in there. It was constant splits on the left, and the PCs had nowhere to go but up. So we need to consolidate at some point. I think that the Liberals have proven themselves to be completely feckless. Even their federal cousins, who were very close to Kathleen Wynne, had no interest in even touching the Ontario Liberals this time.
Nope.
Trudeau was blowing it up with Doug Ford instead. And if the federal Liberals can see the touch of death on these guys, I think we as ordinary liberal progressive voters should recognize the same. It's time to stop wasting our votes in a party that has no interest in strategically finding them. You mean they can't even run their leader in a secure riding. Von Ridbridge, like he lost, he was humiliated. He wasn't even close. Yeah. And like, come on, that's like Annamie Paul level failure, basically. Like, that's just inexcusable.
I guess he's not an ex-PM, so I'll let him off there, but it's shades of when John Turner was seen hurriedly campaigning in his own riding in 1984. This was the Prime Minister of Canada, who knew he was going to have his ass handed to him by Mulroney at that point, desperately trying to hold on to his seat, which he did. But, like, that was how unprecedented it was. Like, it's not like prime ministers ever spend any time in their actual riding. They just don't, because they have other places to be. This guy had to be in his riding to fight to save his butt. And the same with Del Duca, he was in his riding trying to save his butt, and he couldn't. And, you know, Barrie, I'll give an example of just how out of it the Del Duca brand was. You know, I grew up in Barrie, Ontario. I spent time there from when I was 9 to when I was 18. And now we had a mayor named Jeff Lehman, who was very popular, and who's actually liberal, but he's very popular and very well liked. He ran in one of the 2 Barrie ridings provincially for the Liberals and lost to the nameless incumbent.
Brutal.
That's how little interest anybody had in the Del Duca Liberal brand. Anybody, you mentioned Del Duca, they're like, who?
Yeah.
like they just, and again, like, I'm not saying that the Liberals, the Ontario Liberals didn't try, but whatever they tried obviously didn't work. And that's a massive failure when no one knows who you are, when the people who do know who you are don't like you, because he had bad negatives as well for people that knew him. And when your promises are like a word salad, like there were a couple of cool promises that came out where I was like, okay, this is the right track. But then I remember I was reading a post-mortem by a columnist this morning, can't recall who they were, but they were saying something along the lines of, you know, Del Duca's handgun ban. Oh, it was Robin Urbach from Globe and Mail. She was writing that, you know, Del Duca sort of had all these kind of sort of oddball promises that he thought might be, you know, catchy enough to get attention. And Buckarai definitely got a lot of attention. But then, you know, the handgun promise, like to work with the feds to ban handguns, you know, the feds just banned handguns and didn't bother consult with him. So like he just looked like he didn't have his finger on the pulse. And some of that wasn't intentional. Like, I'm sure the feds didn't warn him about the pending handgun legislation, and I'm sure, but like, these are events, and these events sometimes make you look a certain way, and the way that you respond to them matters. And the way he responded was just, I don't know, his communication skills they left something to be desired. He knew his policies well, but he couldn't communicate them well.
But it's not just him. I think this is more systemic. There's a cancer in the whole party. Like the NDP and the Liberals both captured roughly 25%, about a quarter of the popular vote. The NDP was able to convert that quarter of the vote into basically a quarter of the seats. They had a relatively efficient transfer of votes to seats. The Liberals didn't. They were 3 times less efficient than the NDP. It's just a failure of strategy. In the last week of the campaign, they literally had campaign staff dress up as chickens. They dressed up in chicken suits to harass PC volunteers to make some sort of social media ad saying, oh, the PCs are being chickens for not debating us in public forums on a riding-by-riding basis. Like, that was their big, you know, throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. That was their big strategy, to dress up their campaign staff as chickens and film them. Like, it's just a complete joke of a party. And it needs to be treated as such. I know there was a time when I was a member of the Ontario Liberals and I was working inside and I was very arrogant, and friends of mine who worked in Joe Harden's campaign, and I had been a staffer for Yasser Naqvi, and so I was being poached to work on Joe Harden's campaign, and I said, never in a million years is the NDP going to win this riding. You know, the NDP's been stuck in third place forever. That's where they're always going to be. The Liberals, sure, they're going to win the 2018 election, but they'll come back stronger than ever. That's just the brand. The brand is strong. I have to eat those words now. I was arrogant 4 years ago. I have lost that sense of liberal arrogance now, because there's just a certain number of failures that I can't accept before I have to decide, like, is completely unacceptable. And Joel Harden, the MPP here in Ottawa Centre, where I live, who I was making fun of in 2018, he's now being touted as a potential successor of Andrea Horwath. Unfortunately, he was also quoted as the first one last night on election night to say that the NDP needed a change in leadership. And very often, if you're the one seen putting the knife in the leader of the party, it's very rare that you'll end up replacing the leader of the party. I think he'd be a great name as well, Joel Harden, if we can't get Mike Schreiner on board. But that's basically the spiel I have. It's, I'm going to have to bite my bullet. I still have friends that work in the NDP, but I think that's basically where I'm going to have to go at the provincial level. And I did the same thing in Alberta as well. I was a very fervent PCer. Well, once the PCs collapsed and the UCP went in a completely far right ideological direction, and the NDP is feeling more and more like Alberta's Liberal Party, that's just where you have to end up as a centrist. It's like I'm definitely not a socialist, although I certainly flirt with the ideas from time to time. But the bottom line is, if you're a Liberal activist and you have friends that are asking you to work for the NDP at the provincial level in Ontario, there's no good reason to turn them down at this point. I'm going to reach out as well to the Joel Harden campaign, particularly if Joel Harden, my MPP, runs for leader. I think I'm definitely going to have to get involved in that campaign. They're just the only credible alternative at this point. They're the only really serious people, and now that they've gotten rid of their leader and they're willing to put a fresh face to that party, it seems pretty obvious to me that they're going to be the only solution to an eternal Doug Ford. And you know what? Even if Doug Ford goes off to become the Prime Minister of Canada, because he seems to have zero interest in being Premier of Ontario, even though he just got elected for that job. I mean, the guy just is so bored at any press conference. He hates talking to the journalists. He hates doing his job as a Premier. He loves campaigning, hates doing his job.
Yeah.
His nephew, Michael Ford, just won in York Southwestern. And then Mike Harris's son, Mike Harris Jr., just won in Kitchener-Conestoga. So we have a PC dynasty that's being built. So even if Doug Ford is gone, his scions are going to be controlling the province for as long as we progressives allow them to control the province. And that's the key word, allow. Because a minority of people still elected the PCs. It was not the majority. The instant that we progressives get our shit together, we can get these guys out. The problem is in our house, not with them. The problem is with us. We need to solve it.
I agree with that. I wish I could say, Doug Ford, I've said, Doug Ford's so good at this, so good at that. I wish I could also say, the public should have eaten the message up more, but that's not how it works. It's not the public's job to eat your message up more. It's your job to make sure the public eats it up.
Yeah, exactly.
So anybody saying, it's the public, it's the voters, and yes, the turnout was disappointing, but anybody not enough people turned out, that's disgusting. Yeah, it is sad, but I don't blame anybody if they didn't want to vote in that damn election, to be honest with you.
Oh, I will say, so I did check the polls in my riding before I voted. I was thinking about voting NDP the whole time, but then when I saw the polls and it seemed obvious the NDP was going to win, I actually voted for the Greens in this election because I knew the Green candidate. She was the leader of the Carleton Greens back when I was in the executive of the Carleton Young Liberals. If the NDP had ever been, and if there's any sort of question as to who was going to win my riding, I probably would have voted for the NDP. And I just hate that we have an electoral system that makes me think like that as well.
Yeah. And
that's how I am in every ride. That's how I am in every election. I'm always scouring the polls. I'm looking at every possible forecast, seeing what the percent chances of who's going to win here and where the possible coalitions are. This electoral system barely gives me any time to think about what my own values are and what I would like to see reflected. I'm just trying to get rid of whatever fucking jerk is happening to be oppressing us at this time.
That's first past the post, and that's something that I don't want to say it'll never happen because I never say never, but that's something that's taken a while to happen because of parties getting into power, promising it, and then realizing that they actually like the system because it got them in power. So we're at a crossroads there, and I hope it happens. That's something that's still very near and dear to me, and something I think we definitely desperately need is some sort of change to the electoral system because of what Jacob said. It forces you to make strategic decisions between Mr. Shitty and Mrs. Shitty. It's ridiculous. And that's not going to come from the PCs. I'll be blunt. Like every single party except the PCs, who have just formed a second majority government, promised electoral reform. The PCs are not going to look into that. And it's a good chance that if one of the other parties got into power, they'd drop it too, because that's what the Liberals did federally.
Yep.
They dropped it when they realized it got too difficult and that people didn't like the system that the Prime Minister favored. So they, instead of going, oh, well, that's what the Canadians want, they want some sort of proportional rep, they go, oh, no, that's too much work and we don't like that. And they abandoned it. It was very cynical and sad. And so that's usually what happens, or like there's been referenda on it in the past. And there was a BC referendum. There were two actually. And then there was another referendum in Ontario at one point during the McGuinty years. And it was, they all failed because you get low turnouts at those kinds of things, and the only people who turn up for the most part are either nerds like us who are motivated to change the system, or people who like really don't want it changed, like they're just anti any kind of change. And I feel like a lot of the time people don't really clearly know what they're even voting for. And like I think if electoral reform is going to come, it needs to be just done by Parliament. It just has to be.
I absolutely agree. Absolutely.
In an ideal world, it would be great to have people weigh in on it, but with this kind of thing, you just have to change it by an act of Parliament. Japan did that too. They changed their system by an act of Parliament. And it's really not that hard to do. It's the political will and not being so cynical. But everybody's cynical, including the people in power, for different reasons.
There's a really strong status quo bias in any sort of referendum.
Yeah.
And it's...
Yes.
As you said before, in any change, there's winners and losers. The people that feel that they're going to lose in the change are going to be the ones often that are the most motivated to turn out and prevent the change from happening or to reverse it. And that's why we have the same reactionary turn in conservative politics that we're seeing right now, reaction to changes in our society. And it's often why in referendums there are older people that would see their vote share really shrinking in a proportional representation are also going to be really against it. The way that we structure our elections right now really favor a certain type of voter that lives in probably more rural rather than urban demographics, that are a little bit older, the people that are going to the polls more often, and the parties basically are catering towards. If we changed our electoral system, it would also change the voters that our parties are looking for. They would start paying attention to all voters rather than just the handful of well-organized voters that need to move out in particular locales.
Yeah.
And that would mean a completely different electoral calculus. And there are some people who would lose in that electoral calculus. Some people, by the way, who deserve to lose in that electoral calculus. It's a shame that young people feel that there is no representation for. Well, they don't feel that. It's a shame that it's true that there's no representation for young people in our politics today. I'm never going to blame someone that doesn't show up to the polls when these are the choices that are put forward to them.
Yep. So basically, the message that we're kind of arriving at here is we're still cynical, we're still angry, we've got 4 more years of a government that we don't like. I want to touch on one thing you said. So when you were saying that you're going to get involved with the NDP, I don't fault you for that. But if I were still in the province, I wouldn't be working for any of the idiots, to be honest with you.
What's the alternative?
I'm in a bit of a wait and see mode. I mean, I am here in Nova Scotia too. I'm sort of in a wait and see mode to see how, like, the NDP here are having a leadership contest, the Liberals here are having a leadership contest. I'm waiting to see how those parties kind of align themselves and figure it out. I think it's too early. Like, if I were in Ontario and someone asked me tomorrow, do you want to come to work for Joel Harden? I'd say, I don't know. I really don't know, because right now it'd be great if he becomes leader, and I like him a lot, and I like what you've said about him. But you're right on the one hand, is there any alternative? Like, we have to pick an active left-wing party that actively gets a lot of support in the system, and I agree. But I would be in a wait-and-see mode because I haven't decided yet which of the parties even deserve my involvement. Like, that's kind of... Not that, like, my involvement is worth that much to them. I'm not saying that. I can't just soullessly work for someone that I don't somewhat believe in, if that makes sense. I have to believe in... And of course I believe in some of the guiding principles of the NDP, but I also believe in some of the guiding principles of the Liberals. You're not always going to like every single leader of a party that you belong to. Like, I'm not saying that I have to be super happy with every single leader that's elected, but if they can't even do their jobs, so that's where I'm at. It's like, we just watched 2 opposition leaders, Steven Del Duca and Andrea Horwath, who just couldn't do their jobs effectively. And I don't want to go and put 4 years of blood, sweat, and tears into an operation that I don't think is even going to move votes. There's something to be said for being in the room and being part of the change, but also, as a rank and file volunteer, it's not like I'd be in any significant position to influence the change anyway for how they restructure the party. What I have to do is just wait and see how they start restructuring their party and how they start messaging and how they start communicating, and then I'll have to make a decision from there.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I'm at.
I think this sort of betrays that you and I grew up in just very different political contexts, because when I started getting involved in politics first in high school, I grew up in a riding that provincially was switched to the Wildrose in the 2012 election. So I had a former Baptist minister as my MLA in Alberta, and he was a man who was very public about the fact that he prayed and God would tell him whether to vote for or against a budget. And God also told him apparently that if the feds ever decriminalized marijuana, there'd be a communist revolution. And then he also compared at many points Justin Trudeau to Stalin, and also sort of suggested that the federal Liberals were going to bring apart like a collectivization of farmland that would end up in the famine and killing of thousands of Albertans. So I had a complete crazy lunatic as my MLA that I wanted to get rid of.
He's a crank.
Yeah, he was. And he still is my MLA back in Alberta, by the way. He still is. I had just an absolute loony as my MLA, and the only possible alternative at the time when I was in high school to get rid of them was the PCs. And I knew the guy that was running or I knew one of the people that was running for the nomination, so I got involved with the PCs and started working with them. My politics is completely different than the Progressive Conservative Party, but I couldn't care less because my goal was to get rid of the worst person and replace them with someone who's slightly better. And I think that's more or less been my defining principle. I would love to work with people that really reflect my values and that energize that spirit in me, and I felt like I was doing that when I worked for the Justin Trudeau campaign in 2015.
Same, yeah.
But the truth is, at the end of the day, the times when I've actually been successful in politics, it's not just working for a vision. It's when I have a very strategic goal and I find the best possible avenue to achieve that goal. And I think right now, if the goal is to get rid of Doug Ford and the PCs, I was in a wait-and-see mood, too, because I thought that both the NDP and the Liberals were fairly well matched, and I was hoping that this election would basically determine who the main vehicle to replace Doug Ford would be.
Yeah.
I think that's basically what we got. The NDP is that vehicle. I think we just need to accept the results of the election and move forward from there. I think of myself as a Liberal. I'll always be a Liberal, but at the end of the day, the parties are also realigning as well. Like, if the NDP is not really the party of the working class anymore, as Doug Ford is willing to take credit for in his victory speech, the PCs are sort of becoming that party. They're getting more union support. The NDP is not really a socialist party anymore. They're moving towards much more of a moderate position because the academics and a lot of the activists that are making up their movement are becoming more mainstream.
And I completely get that logic. There's different dynamics in each province, like you were just touching on Alberta's dynamics and how different that was. And it was a 40-year, one party was in power there for 40 years when you were growing up, and the Wildrose were influential, but only in your parts of the province. And in Ontario, it's very much been red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, with one big chunk of blue in the 40s to the 80s. But other than that, mostly red, blue, red, blue, red, blue. We've seen for the first time the NDP getting back into official opposition in Ontario, which is something significant. Not significant enough to keep Andrea Horwath around, but significant enough that, like you said, maybe it's finally time to stop the red-blue switching. Maybe it is finally time to throw your weight. Like, if you must throw your weight behind someone at this very moment, they're the most logical. And I agree in terms of like the seat count and the funding. Like, this will be the second term in a row where the Liberals will get no funding in the legislation.
And totally in debt. Yeah.
They managed to pay off their previous campaign debt. Like, they're in dire straits. This is going to set them back quite a bit, I think. So I get your logic. I get that you don't need to feel in love with every single campaign you do. And I to an extent, I'm similar, and I don't fault you for joining the NDP, because if I was you, I would make the same choice. But for me, what I come back to is I have to see them prove it first, a little bit. I have to see them put a team together, and I have to see them start putting figuring out what they want to sound like and what their priorities are and how they're kind of marketing themselves before I sort of decide, okay, yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. In the past, the interest groups that most define the NDP as being particularly radical would be probably their BIPOC activists, those that were advocating for the rights of people of color, for Indigenous people. and as well they're LGBTQ activists, those activating for the rights of gay or genderqueer people. And those aren't really considered radical anymore. Society as a whole is actually very rapidly moving in that direction. There, of course, is a reaction to that is moving in the opposite direction. You can see that in the Conservative Party. But as a whole, society is becoming much more left on cultural issues. And so those two factions that used to be in previous generations considered very radical aren't. They're mainstream. And so the NDP is not shifting to the center, but society as a whole is shifting a little bit left to meet the NDP where it is. And the Liberals, of course, under Justin Trudeau's leadership, had to very, very quickly move themselves to the left to keep up with that mainstream cultural shift. You saw that with Justin Trudeau kicking out anyone in his caucus who didn't believe in abortion rights for women. You saw that with him kicking out two men that were accused of sexual assault. And, these were things that you can imagine Jean Chrétien or even Paul Martin dealing very differently. And now, of course, that the Trudeau Liberals federally and even the Ontario Liberals and provincially have lost basically all sense of fiscal discipline. And we see that the voters don't really care. I mean, they just elected Doug Ford, who also is just as big in taxing and spending as any other Liberal. It's pretty clear that the NDP and the Liberals are meeting themselves in the middle. And there's not really much of a differentiation between the two parties. And that's where I think we as activists need to recognize that the shift is occurring, and we need to move with the shift. We need to encourage the consolidation of the parties, because that's where the voters are going, that's where society is going, that's where our parties are moving, even if we don't want to acknowledge it.
But, in Nova Scotia, the PC government got in power here by, in part, running left of the Liberals financially, which, who the hell saw that coming? The PC's running to the left of the Liberals financially. And then Doug Ford went and did a similar thing. So, it leaves me with, it works, and it leaves me with questions, not that I want to go join the PCs, but it more so leaves me with questions about okay, are the Liberals going to be the same as they were and be to the right now financially, or are they going to go back to being a bit more left wing? Because the Liberals in Nova Scotia were very fiscally conservative for about the past decade, and the PCs exploited that. So it'll be interesting to see whether the Liberals stick to that sort of balance the budget kind of thing, which is very Stephen Harper of them, or if they're a little bit more big spender like the PCs are. And then you have the NDP in Nova Scotia, who they got a majority government in 2009 under Darrell Dexter from 2009 to 2013, and then they got knocked out of power by Stephen McNeil's Liberal majority, and they've only been hovering around a handful of seats since then, 5 or 6 seats. So I'm just kind of watching the longtime NDP leader here has stepped down. Obviously, Ian Rankin stepped down as a Liberal leader after he lost the election. But I have the luxury of playing it safe. Maybe if I was in Ontario, I'd be like, hey, this is way more urgent now. But in Nova Scotia, we just had sort of a change election last year. So I'm just kind of seeing how the opposition parties position themselves against the incumbent to kind of figure out which way I want to go there. Because as of right now, there have been a few sort of blunders here and there with the PCs, like there are with every government, but they haven't done anything super major to piss me off yet, which speaks to, at the current moment, how invisible the opposition is. But again, in their defense, they don't have leaders. So that's why I'm interested to see how they're going to start framing things, and because I don't expect Tim Houston to pursue basic income. I don't expect Tim Houston to pursue a lot of those core progressive ideas, despite the fact that I think some of what he's promised is progressive, but it's just enough to win over enough former Liberal voters. It's not enough to be a fully fledged progressive party, I don't think. So I don't imagine there would be a world where I would support the PCs. It's just more so, who do I go with? But I hear you. I think what you said makes sense.
Before we close out there, when you're talking about the NDP needs to show themselves in Ontario, is there a fan favorite that you have for who would lead the NDP?
I mean, so obviously Joel Harden's been floated. I think a lot of people they float Guritan Singh.
Oh yeah,
Jagmeet Singh's brother.
Mm-hmm. But he did. I don't think he lost because the PC's.
Did he lose the seat?
PC swept Brampton, so I think he.
Well, and one thing I meant to touch on as well, actually, just a brief pivot, is when you were talking about the PCs becoming the party of the working class. You're right. They won 2 Windsor Essex ridings.
Yeah, exactly.
Last night.
It's amazing that could happen. Yeah. It's
So,
unimaginable. The factory parts of like the steel working parts, the auto working parts of the province are not really the NDP strongholds anymore.
you need a leader, in my opinion, who can bring the NDP back in touch with their working class roots. I think that's super important. I don't think that you can be a left-wing party and not be in touch with what workers want. That's supposed to be our bread and butter, and the fact that we've ceded ground to that to conservatives on that is pretty embarrassing. Not that it should become the priority again. Like, I still think it's important to be intersectional and to be progressive in everything you do, but that has to include workers. And I don't know what happened with Horwath. They just lost touch. So really, I don't know their caucus well enough really to pick someone.
Well, it can be outside a caucus. That's why I said fan favorite. It can be out like anyone. Anyone's on the table.
Oh man, I'm trying to think of like major left wing. Like maybe a guy like Avi Lewis. I think he ran for the NDP in BC. He's the husband of Naomi Klein. Like both are quite influential climate activists.
And his biggest reason for not being able to take the NDP leadership is his failure to speak French, which isn't really a huge thing in Ontario politics.
No.
So you want to be able to say something to the Franco-Ontarian, but whatever. Like,
Well,
obviously,
look at Doug Ford. He doesn't speak French.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like Doug Ford, he canceled the French university. He had a PC caucus member leave him because of that. She ran for the Liberals and almost was able to win her seat on the Liberals, but no, ended up being replaced by another PC. So in the end, he gave a big old FU to Franco-Ontarians, and they shrugged it off.
Well, then I guess I'd have to go with Avi Lewis. I mean, most of the high-profile progressive voices I know of are people who are either ex-liberals or who are current liberals or who are current maybe federal NDPers. I don't know a lot about Ontario NDP or anybody really like. And I think that's part of their problem.
Yeah.
To be honest, like that's part of our spectrum. The side of the spectrum's problem is we don't seem to have people who are like notable people. I'm not saying that everybody should run a celebrity, but we need somebody who can get themselves known. Like, and the fact that I know very few of them, I think, is to their detriment. Someone who can get themselves known and bring the NDP back in touch with the workers' roots of the party would be my vote.
Well, I mean, the Liberals are obsessed with keeping everyone on message and on point, so it's impossible for anyone to let their star shine because they always have to mimic whatever the Prime Minister is saying at all times. They have a few members of his cabinet that seem to have their own personalities, but there's very few people in his caucus that feel the ability to speak out, and that sort of trickles down to the Ontario Liberals as well. Like there's no stars that come out. Like in the NDP, it's impossible for stars to come out of that caucus because they had the same leader for so long that was sucking up all the oxygen. If there's someone that would come from outside the party, I was thinking like Nathaniel Erskine Smith would be.
Oh, okay.
That's when we were doing our pre-chat. That's another name I was floating. So Mike Schreiner, of course, outside the party as a Green, but I think that Nathaniel Erskine Smith is an Ontario MP for the Liberals. And the reason why I pick him is because I think one of the main dividing lines right now between the NDP and the Liberals is that the NDP prefers less of a top-down approach. The NDP and the Liberals, they seem to have very similar policy platforms, but the NDP is really against authority. They really prefer to have their debates out in public. They don't like to do backroom negotiations or deals. They have a lot of, to be honest, party infighting they do in front of media cameras, which is unheard of for Liberals. And Nathaniel Erskine Smith is one of the few Liberals that's actually willing to debate with his party in public. I think sort of fits the profile well. And he sort of has more progressive ideas than the rest of his party. I think in general, if he's someone that has ambitions, he knows well enough that he's said enough that he's never going to make it to cabinet.
Yeah.
Like when you've attacked your party or when your party feels attacked by you, you're not going to make it into the inner circles of power. So if he wants to use his platform for a greater good, I would suggest that it's probably time to move on to a different party. Basically do a reverse Bob Rae. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, and it's funny because if we were talking about federal NDP, like I could cite lots of names right now, like maybe Kennedy Stewart, he's the mayor of Vancouver, maybe Avi Lewis.
Yep. So that's the thing. Is like I can think of lots of BC people, like Nathan Collin as well. It's difficult for me to think of.
But why would they come to Ontario?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Nathaniel Smith, that's like he's in Ontario as well. That's sort of why I wanted someone in Ontario, but it's like the NDP hasn't been growing there. The NDP has not been focusing in Ontario, the biggest province. They've been cut out, really.
No, which is shocking because they're about to enter their second term as official opposition.
Yeah.
Which is why, again, I'd like to see them set up shop before I sort of, I don't want to say endorse, because it's like, what does my endorsement mean? But before I start kind of saying, oh, I like so-and-so, I don't want to start saying anything before I've seen them set up shop, and same with here in Nova Scotia. But I think Jacob and I are both feeling very, very, very disenchanted at the moment. Disenchanted. Yeah. And on that note, there's lots to hope for.
Forward more years! Forward more years!
There's lots to hope for, which is that 4 years does go by in a flash. I can't believe that 2018 was even 4 years ago. So hopefully not too much havoc is wreaked from now until then, and I hope in 4 years we can sit back and talk enthusiastically about good progressive options. But until then, we're gonna have to
Mike Schreiner supermajority. That's...
Mike. You can. And on that note, I hope you enjoyed listening today. If you have any feedback for us, as always, you can hit us up at speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. We always love to hear from you. And until then, we will see you in the next episode.
Bye.